Hey, this is executive producer and host of the Break It Down show, Pete A. Turner, and this is our limited series called The Prison Chronicles. Somebody's murdered in the United States every 30 seconds. Convictions for first-degree murder commonly carry a prison sentence of 15 to life. And ultimately, most inmates are eventually released, which begs the question, what condition do we want inmates to be in as they complete their incarceration? If I told you that most inmates walk out with less than $1,000, would you feel positive about their chances of becoming a contributing member to society? What if I told you that number is a lot closer to $200 and less? Now what are your thoughts? Previously on the Prison Chronicles.
Many people, live by that code, and they're in those two places that I talked about. They're either dead or sitting in prison.
By 88, I was a year in as an active gang member. My 13th birthday, I started following my older cousin and became a member. I would call myself a gang banger at that point, because a banger is actively pursuing enemies for violent engagement. And I wasn't doing that.
I got kind of swept up in that whole culture around the war on drugs and everything that came with it. And it's the typical story, growing up in a broken, dysfunctional household, end up in the streets, get caught up in street culture, make some poor decisions, end up in prison. And that was kind of that trajectory.
I took a lot more chances and risks, not really knowing why, which led to prison. When I lost emotional anchor that was the Marine Corps, I attached to something else and someone else. And that became a driving factor. And in trying to help that person, I went to prison for 23 years.
I had already pretty much put myself on autopilot. It was just like, I wasn't going to take a loss. I wasn't going to accept that. I always carried a weapon at that point in my life. I was carrying a weapon around, loaded. And they left the scene, and I continued looking for them after the fight. And they returned to the scene. I shot two of them. One died at the scene. Another was struck, but not fatally. I was out of control with my anger, and the dangerous part was I didn't give myself any other option. There was nothing like now. I know there's so many different directions I could go. At that point, backing down wasn't one of them, and losing wasn't one of them, because it's like I already knew what I was going to do before it even happened. I left myself no other option.
These are the Prison Chronicles. In episode 1, we used Heather's murder to help us remember the damage communities suffer when someone is murdered. And then we started getting to know our former inmates. Episode 2 and 3 continue their path to prison, what it was like to be them, what they went through. And this is how we're going to understand the whole there but for the grace of God go I for these people. Look, I believe in the ground truth. In over 1,000 combat patrols, conversing with thousands of people in conflict zones, I've learned a few things about life, about culture, about understanding the infrastructure of someone's mind. The things that they learn and grow up with matter, and it affects who they are and how they make decisions, what they believe. It doesn't matter what you believe, it matters what these guys believe. And until we're able to understand the ground truth, we can't reliably help or understand anybody. In episode 2 and 3, The Path to Prison, we're going to begin to understand the impact of environmental factors on our former inmates. How does a convicted murderer grow up? What happens when a person's childhood culture is one where there are only two options, death or prison? Let's start with Anerae VeShaughn, who spent 2 decades in prison for murder. A quick note, you're going to hear Anerae talk about CYA. That's the California Youth Authority, which is now known as the California Division of Juvenile Justice, or Juvie. Anerae, can you give us an idea, what's the environment for you or for your peers or someone like you as you're on this path? I mean, do you know you're on a path going to prison?
I think that, and this is an unfortunate reality of our society, or my little microcosm of it, we had celebrated the concepts of living and dying on behalf of what I call the parasite. Mm-hmm. gang psychology. We believed it was a worthy thing to live and die for and to give your freedom for. We believed that that was a legitimate, like, viable future. And so there was an awareness of where the road led. Very few success stories, very few positive outcomes at all. And they were almost mythical stories, like Bigfoot, Nessie, the guys who made it, who succeeded, some football league or college, high school, something. For the most part, we all knew CYA was a destination. We all knew we were going to CYA. All of us who went to juvenile hall, who had been exposed to a county program, we all knew that the end result was going to be incarceration at best. And we pretended like that was acceptable, like we didn't care. It was a rally cry, you know? The part that's sad is that all that stuff was really a Band-Aid. I say you could put a Band-Aid on a bullet wound. Highly insufficient method for dealing with an injury. But it was a psychological defense mechanism. So nihilism as a Band-Aid for a wound that really was about a larger societal injury. The lack of proper schools, the lack of funding, the lack of mentors, the lack of legitimate father figures. We were really inside of this entertainment-driven circus that had no value for our long-term existence. On some level, we knew that was wrong, but we also didn't know what to do about it. So I know for sure that there was a darkness. I call it my dark companion. I didn't become aware fully that I had my dark companion, meaning a force that was with me through those experiences, a magnetic spiritual force that was present. I didn't know that existed until it was gone. When the weight of its removal happened, I was conscious that that thing had been with me. That darkness had been with me for a while. And I was conscious it wasn't so happy to let go either. The parasite. Because it knows. It doesn't want to lose you once it has you. It needs you to advocate for it. It's a very dark creature. Most people are born with certain instincts that aren't overtly negative. And so your natural disposition has to be corrupted. And usually it's by life and circumstances and what I call excuses, opportunities for excuses to justify actions. So I have no value for this person's life because they killed my homeboy. They A, B, C, or D. So if I focus on the picture right in front of me, I don't ever have to answer for the larger role I play in this entire machine, this entire structure that allows me to act like genocide is not genocide. That's a lot to come to to realize and then have to make alterations to be able to do better and be better. That's a lot, and it requires a lot. And usually what that requires is some type of adversity, significant adversity, that's going to push you to have to question and challenge these things and get out of the casual joke aspect of it. It's not even casual joke, there's casual indifference. Human life, self-preservation, all of the things that make humans human are systematically removed from us step by step by step, so that we're willing to be killing machines or show them. That's really what it comes down to. So I can admit that I was conscious that this was happening. I did know in the culture that there were aspects of glorification that I was embracing, the movies, the music, the clothes. It was just it's an industry selling that psychology all across the board. It's an industry in this country. And we embraced it and advocated it. Some aspects of it came from the culture itself and were magnified by Hollywood, and other aspects of it were magnified by Hollywood, written by Hollywood, and became aspects of the culture. So art imitating life, it was art imitating life and life imitating art all at the same time. By 88, I was a year in as an active gang member. My 13th birthday, I started following my older cousins and became a member. I wouldn't call myself a gang banger at that point, because a banger is actively pursuing enemies for violent engagement. And I wasn't doing that yet, but I would represent myself as being from where I was from. And I clothed my raiment was that of a gang member. And so I actually was conscious of where I could and couldn't go. That and the police conversation, the sheriff conversation, that was just something you knew. It was certain places you just couldn't go. And so that was just a fact of my life that wasn't even, at the time, didn't occur to me that it was absurd.
How aggressive is someone in that era? I mean, ultimately you go to jail for 20 plus years because you're breaking into someone's home with your friends and, there's a murder committed. But is that exceptional, or is that fairly common? I mean, could that have happened with 4 other dudes on any other night?
I think so. It was normal. I mean, I can't even tell you the amount of people who just never got caught. That's not the stuff we talk about. And they know they don't have those stories, because to tell those stories is to get caught. So no one knows how you do it and don't get caught, because no one tells that story. Yeah. And so it was pretty normal. You go to a house party, that it's going to be, somebody's probably going to be tripping. Somebody's probably going to brandish a weapon. Somebody may discharge a weapon. And we would weather that and go on with our night like that was a normal thing if no one was harmed. It was just to be expected. Imagine being a kid in Chicago right now, literally, and you just want to go across the street to a store. You cross that street and you're out of your territory now. Or when they did the districting, rezoning for the schools, start shipping those kids to other schools and other neighborhoods. The amount of people who died over that, the engagements and the retaliations as a result of the engagements, it literally caused a war or exacerbated one. And so that's everybody, all those kids knew that was going to happen. And an ugly part of the culture is that you can't refuse to go, or you're a coward and you lose your support. And it's a fear-driven structure. The society, the tough guys are operating with a significant degree of fear. But they wouldn't call it that. They call it loyalty. They call it, they just got a lot of names for what they perceive that to be. But ultimately what it comes down to is person is afraid of being rejected by their support system, because without it, you're not safe. And so fear drives a lot of people into the gang culture. Fear keeps them there. How do you extricate yourself when to do so would cause you to lose a military backing and safety and support? And it becomes known that, hey, you're on your own. And now there is no retaliation for whatever happens to you. And who knows what you've done already on behalf of your neighborhood. So change is discouraged by the existence of fear. I remember Florida Mall, right across the street from where that Tower Records was.
Yeah.
So I wanted to go get a pair of shoes, and I want these shoes. I had to prepare for that as if I was going into a danger zone. I had to prepare for that mentally. I'm going to get in here. I got to take 2 or 3 people with me. I know we got to make sure we all go at the same time. We have to stay together. We knew that we had to be together. We knew that if we saw someone and it wasn't necessary to engage, and we had to have a strategy for how to extract ourselves. What exit are we going to use? If we saw some certain people that they must be engaged. And that was just to go get a pair of shoes or pick an outfit for the weekend. That was just a fact of that experience. And so there was a danger involved in it, and there was a fear involved in it, and then there was this morphed hybrid courage fear thing. Like I'm going. I don't care what nobody thinks. Like I'm going to get my shoes. And so that it bred that casual indifference for self-preservation or someone else's life, because it's like over me being able to go get this pair of shoes I'm willing to have to engage someone, even if that resulted in death and imprisonment. Like, I'm going to get this pair of shoes. And just that statement right now, the psychology, is a huge thing that we have to try to overcome. That's a huge thing, because when you speak of asking someone why they would want to live that way, that same casual indifference kicks in. Like, what you talking about? Like, this is where I'm from. This is my life.
Yeah.
And so the willingness to ultimately to die over trying to purchase a pair of Cortez Nikes it's a trip to be conscious of that. So the first time anyone ever put a gun on me, I remember going to get some Doritos. I was riding on the handlebars. My cousin, Artie Barnes, AJ from 24th Street, riding the Tower Records, was pedaling us over there. And the guy just rolled by on the Jeep, and Artie says, "Don't look back." And, I look back. I'm like, man, he's turning around. Guy drives over the island. His music is playing loud, and he pulled the gun. Gave us the business, like, wait. And we had to take that. We weren't armed. I remember I sat on the handlebars waiting to be shot or to be.
This story that Anerae is telling illustrates the path he's on. And think about this. He's a 13-year-old boy going to buy chips, riding on the handlebars of his cousin's bike. So he's in the 7th or 8th grade. Think about your kid. 7th or 8th grade. How would you handle that? How would your kid handle that? With that thought in mind, allow me to elevate that sense. I recorded an episode with my friend Johnny Walker and his wife Beta. If you don't know Johnny's story already, it's crazy. Johnny was an Iraqi who worked as a linguist for me and for the SEALs. Ultimately, Johnny went on more missions for the SEALs than any SEAL did. So he basically became one of them, and to this day is authorized to wear a SEAL's trident on his chest and be called brother by the SEALs. His impossible story was told in the best-selling book codenamed Johnny Walker, and it's a world-class read. His wife Beta is also a personal friend of mine. I know them to this day. And I sat down with Beta and Johnny shortly after they were both and their kids were sworn in as American citizens. Now, Beta, to survive during their time in Iraq, had to move constantly. Her life was always in threat, and she had to take care of what Johnny couldn't because he was out working. She had to take care of the family, all of the business of the family within a very closed society and a dangerous one. The stories their kids tell of seeing dead bodies, it's just impossible. Beta was constantly worried about her kids being kidnapped or killed. I asked her at one point how many times a month did she fear for her family's survival, where their lives were in jeopardy and not in their own control. She laughed and said, "Better question is how many times a day?" Beta and Johnny's kids lived a terrifyingly dangerous and hard life, in part because of who Johnny worked with, but also because of the groups that they were affiliated with. Check out Beta's story about the time when her kids and her had a gun pulled on them.
So my aunt took us to Baghdad. Everything was okay in the road until we arrived like a small city called Khalas. So the car stopped. We looked around to see what's going on. There was like 3 or 4 cars stopped our car. They were Al-Qaeda with a black mask on their head and with weapons. And they came to the car and say, "Hey," people in the car, they were confused if they say we're Shia or Sunnah, because they don't know what was like that guy who was telling, "What are you?" Like if he said Shia, maybe he will be Sunni, so he will kill them. Yeah. Or the opposite, if he say we're Sunnah, he was Shia, he will kill them.
Yeah. So
we were confused. I just waited to figure out what's going on or who are those people. So I just figured out that they were Al-Qaeda, which is Sunnah. So there was 4 or 5 guys were Shia, but they start to cuss and say bad words about Shia and their holy characters to pretend they are Sunnah. They said, "Who is Shia? Get off of the car. Who worked with American or a family for someone worked for American? Get off of the car." So everybody pretend they are Sunnah, not Shia, and I just hugged my 4 kids like this, and start like shaking and crying. What I have to say to save our life? So they told me, hey, who are you? Where are you going? What, are you working? I told them, no, I'm not. I'm just a widow. Americans killed my husband. I'm just like moving back to my family to Baghdad. They talked to each other, say, make sure who's this lady, and they talked about us something. I cried like, oh God, if they want to kill us, let them kill all of us. I don't want to see them kill my kids in front of my eyes. Please, God, in the same moment, if they kill us in the same moment, all of us. So they went out of the car to talk with the guys inside the car, and they took some people with them to make sure they are not Shia or not working with Americans. In that moment, the American troops just came.
Just by luck.
Yes. Oh my God, we were just lucky.
A few minutes ago, you heard Anerae talking about military backing and the need to protect yourself with the gang and fear. Beta and her kids survived this encounter because of her gang. The U.S. Army happened by and saved Beta and her kids' lives. But let me tell you, from a guy that was there, that story ended with a bunch of people, their heads cut off in a ditch most of the time. I saw the reports. I looked for these guys that did this kind of thing, and it is a miracle that they are alive. Now let's get back to 13-year-old Anerae as he sits on his cousin's handlebars, and they head to Tower Records.
The first time anyone ever put a gun on me, I remember going to get some Doritos. I was riding on the handlebars. My cousin, Artie Barnes, AJ, from 24th Street, riding the Tower Records, pedaling us over there. And the guy just rolled by on the Jeep, and Artie says, don't look back. And, I look back. I'm like, man, he's turning around. Guy drives over the island. His music is playing loud, and he pulled a gun. Called us everything that they're supposed to call you, said what he had to say, and drove off and laughed at us. And that was the end of it. We rode over to Tower Records. I bought LL Cool J's Bigger and Deffer. And I went to bed about my business that night. There was one more conflict and ultimately a retaliation. My cousin felt that was unacceptable to tolerate, and he ended up going to YA like within months of that.
Yeah.
Ultimately really kind of over that experience. And so I had that knowledge that this is what, AJ wouldn't go for that. And that just enhanced my psychology and my disposition, my casual indifference. Retaliation is a must. I heard that repeatedly, and it burned into my brain. Retaliation is a must.
How old were you when this tower trip happened?
I was 13. I probably had been 13 for 16 hours.
13 years old and 1 day. On his way to buy records. And because he looked at someone as they drove by in a car, his life began to change. His cousin went to the youth authority within months, and Anerae was taught several important lessons. Now, look, I worked at that tower that he was headed to, and around the same time, and we were told, avoid going to the mall, which is literally across the street. And if we didn't have to go there, don't go there. And if we did, just go there to get our burrito or whatever it was we had to do and get out. And if we did stick to our business, get out possibly, we'd probably be all right. I was 18, a white dude. I worked at Tower. I was going to college. I had a future. Other than Heather Dunn, everyone I knew had every reason to believe they had a bright future. Anerae was 4.5 years younger than me. And look how closely our paths overlap. I worked at this Tower store that he went to. I was just getting going in college, and he was just getting going in the gangs. By the time I graduated in 92, he was convicted of murder and would spend the next 26 years in prison. Though we were in the same time in the same place, look how different our environments were. I lived in this perfect little idyllic town. We had one act of violence the whole time I was there of any significance. His high school nickname was Luther Blood Bank, and we were told to stay away from it. His world was much more closely aligned with beta walkers in Iraq than it was to mine. Now let's get caught up with Shaka Senghor. Also convicted of murder, he spent 19 years in prison, much of it in solitary confinement. The level of violence surrounding Shaka's youth is shocking, but it's real and common for kids living in Detroit from that era. Beyond the violence and the expectation of being shot, killed, or imprisoned, Shaka makes another valuable link between the lives of urban kids and the PTSD that veterans, like me, suffer from. And he's right. What he and Anerae describe is a life that is often more dangerous than what I experienced in over 5 years spent outside the wire. Describe your world. What's reality?
I mean, I grew up in the city of Detroit. Detroit is a very tough city. The narratives that come out of that city is mostly about the crime and the culture around that. But in reality, it's a very complex city. It does have its tough things to deal with. When I was growing up, I grew up during the height of the crack cocaine era. Like many other people that end up doing long-term sentences, I got kind of swept up in that whole culture around the war on drugs and everything that came with it. And it's the typical story, growing up in a broken, dysfunctional household, end up in the streets, get caught up in street culture, make some poor decisions, end up in prison. And that was kind of that trajectory.
What is good and what is bad when you grow up in the crack cocaine era of Detroit? What does that look like?
I mean, realistically, it's no good and bad. It's wise and unwise choices rooted in the reality of the environment you come from. But, these are just the facts. Like, I honestly, these are the parts of the conversations that I dislike having because it's been well documented and it's nothing new that people are going to hear from me that's really speaks to the real issues. The reality is if you go in any inner city where poverty is rampant, where people of color are, the level of PTSD in those communities is unimaginable, and we haven't addressed that. So anything else I can say is just kind of more fitting a stereotypical profile of what they think people have to do in those environments, and a lot of that is just bullshit. The reality is, you're dealing with a culture where kids have high levels of PTSD, and they make decisions through a lens of trauma that we haven't dealt with in this country, So we think about mass shootings when they happen and, we're like, oh my God, we need to do something about gun control or whatever the case may be, but we're not dealing with mental illness. We're not dealing with PTSD, whether it's military veterans coming back or whether it's kids who've been in a neighborhood where many young people have been shot or where they themselves have been shot. And so that's a more interesting conversation to me, is really just talking about adverse childhood experiences. I encountered gun violence very early on. My oldest brother was shot in the neck, by my brother. I was 14 years old, 13, somewhere in there. Childhood friend murder. 8 men in my family, not 8 men, but 8 members of my family have been shot. And like that's an American story we don't talk about. Like, to really think about that. Like, my mother has 3 sons. All 3 of us have been shot. My older brother has been shot on 2 different occasions. He's currently paralyzed. I have numerous cousins who have been shot, 2 nephews who have been shot. I have a nephew who's in prison who got shot, and then he turned around and shot somebody. Just repeating the cycle. So that level of gun violence, like if I go to my 11-year-old cousin, a 12-year-old cousin, and they're walking down the street carrying a pistol, like, I'm not surprised that that's a life choice they're making. I mean, why wouldn't they make that choice when, 8 members of their family have been shot already? So what does that tell? What is that narrative for them? So that's what it was like growing up in the community, like on that deeper level of not feeling safe. I was shot when I was 17 years old. When you experience that level of trauma, like, your brain doesn't function the way a rational person who doesn't have that level of trauma would normally function. And that's what we don't talk about. It's more about, just making bad choices, etc. And I mean, if you just look at the choices, of course it looks like a bad choice if you look at it without understanding the circumstances that choice derived from. And like, that's the shit we have to deal with, is we have to get down to the rawness of these things are happening in the communities for real, like, not, imagined, so that's what it's like, the inner city. So, and even the part about vengeance, that's all rooted in the PTSD. It's like, okay, I get shot today, likelihood is I'm going to shoot somebody in response to that if you don't get that disrupted.
One of the things that I found a lot from interviewing like Iraqis and Afghan men was they lost the ability to dream. That just wasn't realistic to look 2 years in the head, 5 years in the head. So like, I'd play this game with them where I'd say, hey, I've got a bag of money. What would you do with it? And they're like, I wouldn't do anything. I have nothing to do. I have nowhere to go. There was no escape for them. Does that resonate with someone from Detroit when they're 17 years old?
Absolutely. I mean, the sense of hopelessness and fear in a lot of these communities is unimaginable, where, at the age of 15, you already know that you're going to get shot or you're going to get killed or you're going to end up locked up before you reach the age of 18. So, that's one of the things that has driven my work in terms of like, how do you disrupt that type of thinking? And you pointed out something earlier that I think is really important, right? We don't hear enough from veterans who say, hey, this is a real thing.
Yeah.
This is not some, made for lifetime movie type situation. This is real. This is real life, right? And that you have to consciously talk yourself down. And we haven't equipped kids in those environments who have been through something similar in regards to trauma. It's different circumstances, obviously, but the trauma and the impact it has on their life is the equivalent of what you just shared. When I first got out of prison, I remember being I was in a car, I was a passenger in a car, my ex-girlfriend, and she was driving and she pulled all the way up to almost the bumper of the car in front of her. And the car pulled in behind us almost up to our bumper. And I felt a level of anxiety that she couldn't relate to.
Right.
And so I had to kind of self-talk and say, you know what, I'll be okay, this will be okay, because it triggered trauma from my childhood where these are ways that young Black men get killed. If you grow up in the city of Detroit, you don't get caught boxed in where you can't maneuver and get out, and I'm sure you can relate to that from a military aspect.
Oh, yeah.
But that's how it triggered my mind. So I had to consciously do this self-talk like, yo, it's all right. You're in a Honda Civic. Nobody can even probably recognize you or see you.
Yeah.
It was a real thing, And so, that disrupts the ability to dream about a possibility beyond the next day. Like I went to prison for killing somebody, which means that I, in a moment, in a heated moment of an argument, I fired the bullets that claimed a man's life. Does that make me like a killer, like a person who's like, there's some type of thrill? Like I didn't get any thrill for that. That was a very reactive, very traumatized experience for myself and the family members and et cetera. But that came out of trauma. That didn't come out of, a fetish to kill people.
Now that we've established this PTSD and combat link between urban kids and combat soldiers, let's go back. Let's learn more about Kenyatta's path as he expands on his life leading up to his 3 strikes life conviction.
So yeah, I dropped out of high school in the 11th grade, and I was on this just self-destructive path. I was involved in a lot of illegal activity in the street, and much of that had to do with just me having, just a really warped perception of myself and the role that I play in my community. I was all about just getting money and just focused on, what was right in front of me. I had really no strategic kind of thought process going on. I didn't think that I was going to live past the age of 25. And so, I was living for the day, trying to party as hard as I could and have as much fun as I could. And, that kind of mindset led me down this path towards prison. And when I think back about it, the way that I was living my life, I was literally on like a runaway train, man, that only had 2 stops. And that was prison and a grave 6 feet underground. And, by the grace of God, man, I wound up in prison. I was able to get some help and turn my life around.
Would you say, was this a result of you being young, or was this a failure of community?
I think it was a combination of many things. When I look back on my life, that came about, my behavior and the way that I viewed myself resulted from, me and from my childhood. Me and my 2 brothers and my mother were abandoned by my father. My mom worked 2 and 3 jobs to try to make ends meet for us. And the role models that I had were all in the street, and so, I grew up according to, the street code, man. And that's obviously that's a dangerous kind of mindset to have and a dangerous set of principles to have to live your life by. The results speak for themselves. Many people live by that code, and they're in those two places that I talked about. They're either dead or sitting in prison.
I don't want to go down this hole too deeply, but it doesn't matter if you're in the city and it doesn't matter if you're in the country. That street code, I don't think it knows any boundaries.
It really doesn't. And it's born out of this mindset of fear of what you don't have, fear of what you can't do, fear of what you think people are doing to you. And for me, that fear-based mindset, it just, it led to a whole bunch of, like a slippery slope, man, that just took me down this path. And, I made a ton of horrible decisions that hurt a lot of people, including family members and friends, and stuff that I'm really not proud of. But, I've been able to make amends and change my life. And, that's why I do the work that I do today, is to help other people do the same. I mean, I grew up, hustling in the street, man, trying to make money. I sold drugs, and then my drug of choice to sell was marijuana. A friend of mine that owed me some money for some marijuana, he was going to rob a jewelry store to pay me. And once he told me about the jewelry store robbery, I got intrigued, because me being greedy, I'm thinking maybe I can get the money that he owes me and some of that money too. And so we went and me with my smart self, we went down to the jewelry store and cased it out. Turns out that, it was a death trap. The guys in the jewelry store had guns. There's really no quick way out of there. We were going to, not be successful with that. So I knew of another place that we could go do a quick robbery. We could make the money. He could pay the money that he owed me, and I could get some of the extra money on the side. So we went, we did the robbery. He paid me the money that he owed me, plus I got the money, that I was involved in the robbery with. He ended up going back and trying to rob the same place again without me a week later. Got caught and then told on me. So the police come, arrest me, take me to jail. And my attorney tells me he's going to get on the stand and testify against me. So quite naturally, I took a plea bargain. And the plea bargain was for 2 counts of robbery, because we took money from a safe and a cash register. So this was in 1991. This is significant because this happened in 1991 before 3 Strikes even came out. So I signed a plea bargain for 2 counts of robbery and went and did my time. The whole time that I was there, though, this is really significant, P, because, the whole time that I was there, I wasn't thinking about changing my life. I wasn't thinking about, the role that I played in getting myself there. The only thing that I was thinking about was getting out of prison and doing something to this guy who snitched on me. Right? Because, we talk about this environment and this code, in my mind, the way that I grew up, the snitch isn't, some old lady that's looking out the window because she hears something and sees somebody breaking into a car and calls the police. That's not a snitch. A snitch is when 2 people are doing dirt and then one of them gets caught and tells on the other person. That's a snitch all day. And so I had all this pressure on me from other people in my neighborhood that knew about this to do something to this person. And so the whole time that I was in prison, that's all I was thinking about, was exacting my revenge and keeping my reputation strong in my neighborhood. Well, when I got out of prison, obviously that's a pretty dangerous mindset to have. I got out of prison and fell back in with the same crowd, and about 5 months after I got out, I was pulled over on a routine traffic stop. I'm on parole, so they searched my car, and I had a gun in my car. That gun possession charge served as my 3rd strike, and I got 25 to life for being an ex-felon in possession of a firearm. Now, when we talk about those environmental influences, what I was just trying to explain to y'all was that code of the street, man. I felt like I was obligated, like I had no choice but to get out and do something to this person. That whole mindset took me away from doing the things that could have helped me and took me down this path of, just the same old repeat behavior, And so that was a really, really big mistake on my part. Once I got sentenced and went back into prison, it took me about 5 years to really understand and get to the point that I could admit that I was the problem.
My question is 2-part. One is, What percentage of your errors early on was environmental versus just youthful, where you're required to go exact as vengeance? Is that taught? Is that learned from observing? Were you taught that by older guys saying, this is what you have to do, this is the code?
Yeah, so the first part of your question, I would say the percentage of mine was like 99%, me just making bad choices. I didn't grow up in a bad environment. In the neighborhood that I grew up in, I had guys that, played in the NFL. It was bad to a certain degree, but the fact of the matter is that there were people in my neighborhood that made it out and that are doing great. You know what I'm saying? I had examples around me of what hard work looked like. And, my own mom worked 2 and 3 jobs to support me and my 2 brothers. And so I didn't come from a necessarily bad environment, but I had like this deep hole in my heart, man, this internal hole that I was trying to fill with external things. A lot of it had to do with this decision making these things that I was doing. It was my fault, really. The decisions that I was making. The environment really wasn't so much of a. I will say this. Let me back up a little bit, because I feel like I'm totally responsible for the actions that I take. At the same time, though, there were certain environmental factors that played a role in my decision making. Now, how the percentage of that, I like to think that, the environment didn't have so much of an influence on me, because, when I think back and I look back on it, I have friends that came from the same environment, had the same environmental pressures, but they took a completely different route, and that was all based on the choices that they made. So I don't want to completely blame it on the environment, but I will say that the environment did have a certain influence on me, right? That leads me to this code of the street thing. Now, once I got out of prison, I had these principles in my mind that were instilled in me as a young person. Never snitch, never work with the police, that kind of stuff. You know what I mean? Always stay true to the game and true to the neighborhood. And so these were things that I saw. These were things that were told to me and that I saw reinforced with the behavior of a lot of other people around me. I felt like, I had to live up to that same thing, and yes, that was a decision that I made, but yes, that was influenced by my environment as well too. And so that's kind of a tricky thing right there. When you really think about it, how deeply each of us are impacted by our environment. It's really profound, when you think about it.
That's something you had to do because that was reinforced by the environment that you came from.
Right.
And that's something that's hard for us. That's hard for people to escape,
It definitely is. And had I come home and been like, oh, I forgive him, and I'm not gonna do nothing about this. I'm just gonna go on with my life. That probably would have caused a chain reaction of a whole bunch of other events, that could have put me in a really bad position. So, I didn't want any, and the reason I say fear-based, let me back up a little bit. The reason I say, a lot of this stuff is fear-based is because when I think about it, I was so afraid of what people would think of me. I don't want people to look at me differently, like I'm some kind of punk or something like that. You know what I mean? And so I was afraid of deviating or changing, people's perception of me in that way, and so a lot of the decisions that I made were made from a position of fear. I didn't want to be a victim. I didn't want people to think of me like I'm some type of sissy or a punk or something like that. So I felt like I had to do these things. I felt like I had no choice.
What makes you say, I don't want to take this path, I am going to take this harder path? Like, what do you think it is about you in your wiring back then and your thought process that put you in that position where you wouldn't take something that would be more legal, for example?
Yeah, that's a great question, man, because, again, it was all about perception. I was great in school. I was good at sports. I was great academically. But back then, it wasn't cool to be smart. You know what I'm saying? I wanted to be cool. So I hung out with the kids in the back, and we would make these little, stupid little stuff. We do stupid stuff. The teacher would turn her back and we throw paper at one another and just do dumb stuff. You know what I mean? We'd leave school and go get high and come back to class high, or if we even came back at all. You know, and I did all that as, you know, trying to fit in with this crowd who I thought was cool, and being smart and getting good grades and sitting through class all day was not considered cool. You know, my friends would go off to the beach with a bunch of beer and a bunch of weed and a bunch of girls. You know, what was I gonna do? Sitting in Miss Schaefer's English class, listening to her teach about prepositional phrases all day, or go get high with my friends out the beach and hang out with a bunch of girls. I mean, come on, man. So I wanted to be cool like them. So that's, you know, I mean, that's what I was doing. It wasn't who I was, though. I mean, my true authentic self is not that person. Really, I love to learn. You know, and school really was like a safe place for me. Like I said before, I had all these things going on inside my head, you know, that made me feel like I was less than, or I was different than, and I was like going overboard to try to fit in.
Next on the Prison Chronicles.
For most of these folks, they never had a first chance. So the idea of a second chance is such a misnomer, you know, and it suggests that they blew that first chance in some way. I blew a first chance. They never did. They never had it. They didn't have it culturally. They didn't have it. They had no context. Their parents weren't around. Their parents weren't an example. Their friends weren't. Their idea of success was the guy they saw on the street who had the nice clothes and the jewelry and the cars and the good-looking women. That was their idea of success. Where I grew up, it was Porsches and it was gold Rolex watches and it was cocaine. And that was my idea of success.
Unbeknownst to me why I was excelling, I wasn't any more brave or heroic than anyone else, but I took a lot more chances and risks, not really knowing why.
Sounds familiar.
Which also led to prison.
The father of across the street from us ended up molesting myself and my sister, then his own children. I found out years and years later. And, it was just something that I never talked about, never discussed. I actually kind of just blocked the whole thing out of my memory, I guess.
The Prison Chronicles is a limited series from the Break It Down show from executive producer Pete A. Turner. Hey, we release 5 new episodes a week of the Break It Down show, aka BIDS. It would be awesome if you liked, shared, subscribed, reviewed. Those things always help us out. There are quite a few people to thank and give credit to, including co-producer John Leon Guerrero, who hosted, edited, and directed the music for the series. Also, co-producer Tony Alvarado, who took all of the disparate interviews, exploded them into 1,000 pieces, and put them back together as the writer of the Prison Chronicles. The show is associate produced by Dr. Richard Leday, my field partner in Afghanistan. He helped us work on the research questions and understanding what work is being done academically in the prison systems. He's also a host on several of the episodes and a guest. Music is provided by Eric Stenglin, Hell Nasty, Dylan Sitz, Cushy, Faison. Also, John did some of the music himself too, so he deserves an extra hat tip for that. As always, I want to thank my producer, engineer, editor, Damian Georgiev. And of course, I want to thank all of our guests. There is so much wisdom and power in all of their experience and work, and I cannot say thank you to them enough. Thank you, all of you. If you have comments, suggestions, or just want to get in contact with the show, feel free to email me at pete@breakitdownshow.com or hit me up on social media at Pete A. Turner on all platforms. Thank you again. We'll see you next time.